Say your full name for the record, the judge said. And for the first time in 3 years, my husband looked afraid of the woman he had called just a housewife. The courtroom was cold enough to make the gold rings on every married hand feel like tiny circles of ice. Outside, downtown Chicago moved behind tall windows in streaks of gray traffic and early morning rain. But inside courtroom 6B, every breath sounded too loud. Richard Hale sat at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. His silver cufflinks flashing each time he adjusted the divorce papers in front of him. He had brought 2 attorneys, 1 assistant, and Vanessa Cole, his chief financial officer, who sat directly behind him with her legs crossed, her pearl bracelet resting on the sleeve of a cream blazer I recognized from my own walk-in closet. I sat alone on the other side with a plain manila folder, a cream coat folded across my lap, and a small wooden box balanced carefully beneath my hands. No diamond earrings. No designer bag. No lawyer whispering in my ear. Just me, Emily Hale, the woman Richard had spent 3 years introducing as my wife. She stays home. His attorney leaned over and murmured something. Richard smiled. It was the same polished smile he used at charity galas, board dinners, and holiday parties where I had spent hours remembering which investor hated cilantro, which senator liked black coffee, which partner's daughter had just gotten into Northwestern. He thought those things were small. He thought I was small. Then he slid a signed settlement across the table like he was leaving a tip for bad service. Be grateful, Emily, he said, not quietly enough. Most housewives leave with less. A few people in the gallery shifted. Someone's pen stopped moving. Vanessa looked down, but the corner of her mouth lifted, soft and sharp. I did not reach for the papers. I looked at Richard's signature, bold and careless, cutting through the bottom line like a man who believed every room would always open for him. Then I looked at the wedding ring on my hand. It had a tiny scratch across the band from the night I dropped it near the kitchen sink while making soup for his mother after her last hospital visit. Richard never noticed the scratch. He never noticed much unless it threatened his company, his reputation, or his pride. Judge Margaret Ellis entered with a calm that changed the temperature of the room. Everyone stood. The wooden box pressed lightly against my knees, and for one strange second, I could hear Eleanor Hale's voice in my memory, thin but steady, telling me, "Never let him make you small, Emily. You had a name before you took his." We sat. Richard's attorney began smoothly, describing the marriage as brief, uncomplicated, and financially one-sided. He said I had not been employed during the marriage. He said I had contributed no measurable business value. He said the proposed settlement was generous under the circumstances. Richard stared straight ahead, already bored by my silence. Then Judge Ellis turned a page in the file, paused, and looked over her glasses at me. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "before we proceed, please state your full legal name for the record." My fingers opened around the wooden box. The courtroom went still. Richard tapped his pen once, impatient. I lifted my eyes to the bench and spoke clearly. "Emily Rose Whitmore." The judge's pen stopped. Her face changed by less than an inch, but everyone felt it. She looked back down at the file, then at Richard's attorneys. "Whitmore," she repeated. "As in Whitmore Holdings?" Richard turned toward me so fast his chair gave a small scrape against the floor. Vanessa's smile disappeared. I did not look at either of them. I kept my voice calm because calm was the one thing Richard had always mistaken for weakness. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "That Whitmore." The first time I met Richard Hale, he was not the man in the charcoal suit with 2 attorneys and a woman behind him wearing my bracelet. He was standing under a white fundraising tent in Lake Forest, Illinois, holding a paper cup of black coffee, and trying not to look terrified while his mother sat on a folding chair with a pale hand pressed to her chest. The gala had been loud a moment before, full of donors, champagne flutes, and polite laughter floating over the lawn of the Hale estate. Then Eleanor Hale swayed, the orchestra missed a note, and all the important people froze as if money had taught them everything except what to do when someone needed help. I was 29 then, invited as a junior legal consultant for Whitmore Holdings, wearing a navy dress I had bought off a clearance rack and heels that pinched after 1 hour. I did not know Richard. I only knew an older woman was struggling to breathe while everyone waited for someone else to move. So I moved. I knelt beside Eleanor, loosened the silk scarf at her throat, asked her simple questions, and told Richard to call 911 instead of standing there with that useless cup in his hand. He blinked at me, then obeyed. Later, at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, he found me in the waiting room with my shoes off and Eleanor's pearl scarf folded across my knees. He looked less like an heir that night and more like a son who had suddenly discovered his mother was human. "You stayed," he said. I shrugged. "She asked me not to leave." That was true. Eleanor had held my wrist in the ambulance and whispered, "He looks strong, but he panics when love is involved." Richard heard none of that. He only saw me sitting there at 2 in the morning, hair falling loose, hospital coffee untouched, calm in a place where he felt helpless. For months after that, he courted me gently. Not with yachts or diamonds but with small things that seemed real. He remembered I liked cinnamon in my coffee. He walked me to my car when late meetings ran past dark. He once drove 40 miles just to return a legal pad I had left at his office, though I later learned he could have sent any assistant. Back then he listened. Or maybe I wanted so badly to believe he did. When we married, Eleanor cried quietly in the front pew and pressed a small wooden box into my hands after the ceremony. "For things you may need to remember," she said. Inside was a handwritten letter, a brass key, and a folded copy of a private trust agreement that made no sense to me until much later. Richard kissed my forehead that day and promised I would never feel alone in his house. He was wrong. The Hale Mansion sat 12 miles from downtown Chicago, all pale stone, glass walls and rooms so perfectly decorated they felt afraid of fingerprints. In the beginning I tried to make it warm. I learned the staff's birthdays. I filled the kitchen with rosemary, lemon and fresh bread. I sat with Eleanor through treatments, read to her when pain made television too loud, and wrote down every medication schedule in a spiral notebook that also held soup recipes and grocery lists. Richard started coming home later. Then later became normal. Normal became expected. Expected became silence. At dinners he praised Vanessa for catching market trends, praised his attorneys for protecting the company, praised investors for believing in Hale Group. When guests complimented the evening, he would wave toward me and say, "Emily handles the home things." Home things. As if the dinner that saved his Northbridge deal had not required 3 days of calls, seating arrangements, allergy notes, and a quiet warning I gave him after spotting a dangerous clause in the draft agreement left open on his desk. He signed the corrected version the next morning and called it instinct. I said nothing. Not because I was empty, but because Eleanor was dying, and the company she had built with her late husband was starting to tremble under Richard's pride. 2 weeks before she passed, Eleanor asked me to bring the wooden box to her room. Her hands were thin but her eyes were clear. "If he ever forgets the difference between power and responsibility," she whispered, "protect the company from my son." I wanted to tell her Richard would never become that man. But down the hall I heard him laughing on the phone with Vanessa, talking about expansion, image, legacy. So I held Eleanor's hand and nodded. After the funeral, Richard did not become cruel all at once. He became distant by inches. A missed dinner. A cold answer. A separate bedroom blamed on work. A bracelet missing from my drawer. A perfume I did not wear lingering in his car. And still every morning I made coffee. Every night I opened my spiral notebook at the kitchen island and wrote down what he forgot to hide. Wire transfers, shell companies, signatures that did not match, board minutes that changed between versions. Richard thought I was planning meals. I was mapping the slow theft of his empire. By the 3rd year of our marriage, the kitchen had become the only room in the mansion where I still felt like a person. The rest of the house belonged to Richard's image. The glass office with untouched books behind him, the formal dining room where he performed generosity for investors, the marble foyer where guests looked up and believed wealth meant happiness. But the kitchen was mine. It smelled like coffee before sunrise, basil in the afternoon, and lemon soap after midnight. It was where Eleanor had once laughed at my burned biscuits and told me every powerful family had at least one person quietly keeping it from falling apart. Richard never understood that. To him, the kitchen was proof that I had accepted my place. He would walk in while fastening his watch, glance at the grocery list on the counter, and ask if I could make sure the house looked decent for dinner, as if the house had ever embarrassed him more than his own arrogance. I would nod, pour his coffee into the white travel mug he liked, and watch him leave without noticing the open laptop beside the fruit bowl. On the screen were bank records, acquisition drafts, and calendar notes copied from his briefcase when he came home careless and tired. My spiral notebook sat beside it, disguised under a page titled Chicken Pot Pie. Underneath that recipe were numbers that did not belong anywhere near food. $250,000 routed to a consulting firm with no employees. $780,000 labeled as pre-development expenses. 3 identical signatures from board members who had been in different states on the same date. I did not need to raise my voice. Paper could do that for me. The deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Vanessa Cole was not just Richard's chief financial officer. She was the gatekeeper of every quiet leak in Hale Group. She approved vendors no one could find, delayed audit requests, and pushed Richard toward a merger with Meridian Capital, a firm known for buying family companies, stripping them down, and leaving longtime workers with cardboard boxes and 30 days of severance. Richard thought Meridian would make him untouchable. Vanessa let him believe it. Pride made him easy to lead. One Thursday in October, he called from the car and said he was bringing Vanessa to dinner because they needed to review documents after dessert. He did not ask. He informed me. By 6 o'clock, the long table was set with ivory candles, rosemary chicken, roasted potatoes, and Eleanor's old silverware polished until it caught the light. I wore a simple blue dress and the scratched wedding ring. The wooden box was upstairs in my closet, tucked behind folded sweaters. My spiral notebook was in the kitchen drawer beneath linen napkins. Vanessa arrived in a cream blazer, smiling as if she had been invited home instead of into another woman's marriage. Her bracelet flashed when she handed me a bottle of wine. It was gold with a tiny emerald clasp. Mine. The one missing from my drawer since July. Richard saw me notice it. For half a second, guilt crossed his face. Then he looked away, and that hurt more than the bracelet ever could. Dinner was polite in the way winter roads are polite before they freeze. Vanessa praised the chicken, then asked whether I ever got bored doing the same little things every day. Richard laughed under his breath. I placed the serving spoon down carefully. Repetition teaches you what changes, I said. Vanessa tilted her head. That sounds almost profound. It is practical, I replied. People who pay attention notice patterns. Richard cleared his throat and opened the leather folder beside his plate. This is not working, Emily. The candles flickered between us. He slid the divorce papers across Eleanor's table, past the silverware she had left behind, past the meal I had cooked while reading the merger clause that would have ruined his employees. I want my life back, he said. Vanessa lowered her eyes, but not fast enough to hide her satisfaction. I looked at the papers, then at my husband. He seemed so certain I would crumble. So certain the walls, the money, the name Hale had been holding me upright. I touched the scratched ring once, not with sadness but with recognition. Are you sure this is what you want? I asked. Richard leaned back. I am sure. Something quiet settled inside me. Not anger. Not panic. Permission. I stood, gathered the plates, and carried them into the kitchen like any good housewife would. Then I opened the drawer, took out my spiral notebook, and wrote one final line beneath the chicken pot pie recipe. He chose the door. Tomorrow I open it. The next morning Richard expected tears. He expected pleading, maybe anger, maybe a phone call from me asking to talk things through before the attorneys got involved. Instead, he found his coffee on the kitchen island at exactly 7:15, the way he liked it, black with one cinnamon stick resting beside the mug. The house was quiet. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the windows streaked and the lawn shining under a pale Illinois sunrise. I had already packed 2 suitcases and placed them beside the back door. Not the Louis Vuitton set Richard bought for appearances. Just 2 old Navy suitcases from before I became Mrs. Hale. Inside were clothes, Eleanor's letter, my legal license paperwork, copies of every suspicious transaction, and the wooden box. I left behind the gowns, the jewelry, the framed wedding portrait above the stairs. Let him keep the image. I was taking the evidence. Richard walked in wearing his workout clothes, hair damp from the shower, phone in his hand. He stopped when he saw the suitcases. For a moment, he looked almost young again, like the man in the hospital hallway who once thanked me for staying with his mother. Then his face closed. So that is it, he asked. You are leaving before we even discuss terms? I wiped a water ring from the counter with the dish towel. Habit is strange. Even when your life changes shape, your hands still reach for the small messes. You gave me the terms at dinner. He laughed once without warmth. Emily, do not be dramatic. The agreement is fair. You never wanted the business. You never cared about the public side of my life. I folded the towel slowly. I cared about the people depending on it. He glanced toward the suitcases as if they offended him. You mean the staff? I will make sure they are fine. Not if Meridian gets voting control. His eyes sharpened. There it was. The first crack. Not because I was leaving. Because I had named something I was not supposed to understand. Who told you about Meridian? He asked. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and wondered when love had become a room where one person kept speaking and the other only heard noise. You did, I said. Every time you left documents on your desk. Every time you discussed confidential calls on speaker while I was setting the table. Every time you assumed I was not listening because I was wearing an apron. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice as if the marble walls might testify. Stay out of company matters. I tried, I said. You brought them into our kitchen. For the first time, he did not have an answer. The silence between us felt bigger than the house. Then Vanessa called. Her name lit up his phone, bright and familiar. He looked at it, then at me, and did not pick up. Too late. Some betrayals are not loud because they do not need to be. I reached into the wooden box and removed Eleanor's brass key. Richard stared at it. Where did you get that? From your mother. His jaw tightened. That key belongs to the archive room at the old office. I know. I placed it in my coat pocket. She told me to use it if pride ever blinded you. His face changed. Anger came first, then confusion, then something like fear but smaller and meaner. My mother was sick. She said many things. She was clear when it mattered. I lifted the suitcases. He did not offer to help. That was the final answer I had not known I still needed. By noon, I was at the old Hale Group office in Evanston. A brick building Richard considered outdated and embarrassing. Eleanor had loved it because her husband had signed their first lease there with a borrowed pen and a handshake. The archive room smelled like dust, cardboard, and cedar shelves. I turned the brass key, and the lock opened as if it had been waiting for me. Inside were bankers' boxes labeled in Eleanor's neat handwriting. Trust records. Emergency shares. Whitmore Bridge financing. My pulse slowed. Not from fear. From confirmation. Richard had not built his empire alone. He had been standing on a floor someone else paid for. I copied everything before sunset. Trust agreements. Board protections. A private rescue loan from Whitmore Holdings executed 3 years earlier. Days after Richard's failed expansion nearly pushed Hale Group into default. My signature was not on it. My grandfather's was. But the beneficiary line carried my full name. Emily Rose Whitmore. That night, in a small hotel room less than 5 miles from the courthouse, I spread the papers across the bed, opened my spiral notebook beside them, and connected every line Vanessa thought no one would follow. Shell vendors. False invoices. Meridian options. Richard's careless approvals. At 11:42, I emailed an emergency injunction request to the court. At midnight, I took off my wedding ring and placed it inside the wooden box. The sound it made was tiny. Final. In the morning, Richard would walk into court believing he was ending a marriage. He had no idea I was about to stop a theft. By 9:30 the next morning, courtroom 6B had become Richard Hale's favorite kind of room. Formal, polished, and full of people who assumed he belonged at the center of it. His attorneys arranged their folders in perfect stacks. Vanessa sat behind him with her chin lifted, her pearl bracelet replaced by a thin gold watch, as if removing one stolen thing could make the rest of her honest. Richard did not look at me when I entered. He only glanced at my plain coat, my simple black dress, the wooden box in my hands, and then turned away with the faint satisfaction of a man who believed simplicity meant defeat. His lead attorney, Daniel Price, rose first. He had a smooth voice made for boardrooms and settlements signed before lunch. Your Honor, this is a straightforward dissolution. Mr. Hale has offered Mrs. Hale a generous settlement despite the absence of professional contribution during the marriage. Mrs. Hale has not held outside employment for 3 years. She did not participate in corporate operations, executive decisions, financing, or strategic partnerships. She maintained the household. Maintained. The word landed softly, but it carried the weight of every invisible hour. The judge made a note. Richard sat still. Vanessa's eyes flicked toward me, waiting for shame to do what her schemes could not. I did not give her any. Daniel continued, presenting photographs from galas and holiday dinners. There I was behind Richard, smiling beside floral centerpieces, pouring coffee for investors, standing near the doorway while men in tailored suits shook hands over deals I had helped keep alive. These images established the nature of Mrs. Hale's role, Daniel said. Domestic. Supportive. Non-financial. Judge Ellis looked at the photographs, then at me. Mrs. Hale, are you represented by counsel today? No, Your Honor. Richard finally turned, his expression tightening with annoyance disguised as concern. Emily, this is not wise, he said under his breath. Judge Ellis heard him. Mr. Hale, you will address the court, not your wife. A small heat moved through the room. I stood. The wooden box felt warm under my palm. Your Honor, with permission, I would like to respond to the claim that my role was non-financial. Daniel gave a polite smile. We have no objection, provided Mrs. Hale keeps her remarks relevant. I intend to, I said. The judge nodded. I opened my manila folder and removed the first document, a copy of the Northbridge investor agreement. Mr. Hale, I said, turning just enough to face him, do you remember the Northbridge dinner on March 14, 2 years ago? He frowned. Vaguely. You closed a $200 million development partnership the next morning. His attorney shifted. Richard sat straighter. Yes. Do you remember why the indemnity clause changed between the version delivered at dinner and the version you signed at breakfast? His face went blank for half a second. My legal team reviewed it. No, I said quietly. I did. Daniel stood. Objection. Unsupported statement. I lifted the second page. I have the track changes file sent from the home office computer at 1:18 in the morning, along with the email forwarding record to Mr. Hale's general counsel. Judge Ellis leaned forward. Approach. The bailiff carried the documents to the bench. Richard's face had lost its easy color. Vanessa stopped moving entirely. I continued, not louder, only clearer. That clause would have exposed Hale Group to uncapped liability if Northbridge pulled out after zoning approval. I flagged it while clearing dessert plates because the draft had been left open on Mr. Hale's desk. A quiet murmur passed through the gallery. Judge Ellis looked at Daniel. Counsel, was this included in discovery? Daniel swallowed. Not to my knowledge, Your Honor. I took out another file. There is more. Richard's chair creaked as he leaned toward his attorney. What is she doing? He whispered. I heard him, but I did not look at him. On June 9th, July 22nd, and September 3rd, 3 vendor contracts were approved with signatures that do not match the board authorization records. Those vendors received payments totaling $986,000. None of those companies had active offices, employees, or tax filings in Illinois. Daniel's smile was gone now. Your Honor, this appears to be outside the scope of dissolution. Judge Ellis did not blink. Fraud affecting marital and corporate assets is not outside the scope of anything in my courtroom. For the first time, Richard looked directly at me, not as a wife, not as a housekeeper, not as a woman he could dismiss with a settlement, but as someone holding a match near the paper walls of his perfect life. I opened the wooden box and removed Eleanor's letter. And there is one more reason this matters, I said. Because before Eleanor Hale died, she asked me to protect the company if pride ever blinded her son. Richard's voice cracked through the room. Do not bring my mother into this. I turned to him then. You brought her company into this. The room fell silent. Judge Ellis adjusted her glasses and looked down at the emergency filing on her desk. Mrs. Hale, she said slowly, are you the same Emily Whitmore who filed an injunction against the Meridian merger at 11:42 last night? Richard stood halfway before his attorney pulled him back down. Vanessa's face went pale. I placed my hand on the wooden box and answered, Yes, Your Honor. Judge Ellis did not raise her voice, but the courtroom obeyed her silence as if she had struck a bell. Mrs. Hale, she said, explain the basis of your injunction. Richard's attorney rose again, slower this time. Your Honor, We object to expanding this hearing into a corporate matter without proper notice. Judge Ellis looked at him over her glasses. Counsel, your client filed a proposed dissolution agreement claiming Mrs. Hale has no financial interest in assets that may now be tied to active fraud and an emergency merger. I would call that notice enough. Daniel Price sat down. Richard stared at me with a hard, fixed expression, the kind he used when an employee disappointed him in a meeting. But beneath it, I could see the question forming. Not how did she dare? How did she know? I opened the next folder. The Meridian merger was scheduled for preliminary approval this Friday. If completed, Meridian Capital would receive operational control over Hale Group's development assets in exchange for debt restructuring. On paper, it looks like rescue financing. In reality, Meridian would be able to liquidate properties, terminate long-term staff contracts, and remove protections Eleanor Hale placed in the company charter. Judge Ellis turned a page. And you're standing? This was the moment Richard had never bothered to imagine. I placed the trust agreement on the table and smoothed one corner with my fingertips. Whitmore Holdings provided bridge financing to Hale Group 3 years ago, after the failed Lakeshore expansion. The agreement converted to preferred equity if repayment terms were missed. Those terms were missed twice. As principal beneficiary of Whitmore Holdings, I hold a controlling interest in the protective shares triggered by that default. Richard stood fully this time. That is impossible. His voice was not loud, but it cracked at the edge. My company never defaulted. I looked at him gently, and somehow that seemed to wound him more than anger would have. It did. Eleanor knew. Your general counsel knew. My grandfather knew. You were told it was a private family accommodation so you could save face with the board. He turned to Daniel. Is that true? Daniel did not answer quickly enough. In that pause, Richard lost another inch of the world he thought he owned. Vanessa leaned forward and whispered his name, but he did not look back at her. The judge read the documents while the room waited. Rain tapped softly against the windows again, thin and steady like time keeping count. My hand stayed folded on the wooden box. Inside were my ring, Eleanor's letter, the brass key, and a small photograph from the hospital waiting room years earlier, taken by a nurse who thought we looked like family. I had almost left that photograph behind. I was glad I had not. It reminded me that Richard had not always been empty. He had simply chosen pride so often that it became his shape. Judge Ellis finally looked up. Mr. Price, has your client represented in this court that Mrs. Hale has no ownership position, no business contribution, and no claim beyond spousal settlement? Daniel adjusted his tie. That was our understanding based on information provided. The judge's eyes moved to Richard. Provided by whom? Richard's mouth opened, then closed. Vanessa spoke before he could. Your Honor, Mrs. Hale is mischaracterizing complex financial instruments she clearly does not understand. That was the first mistake she made in front of the judge. The second was smiling at me. Emily is very good at keeping a home, Vanessa added. But corporate finance is not a recipe book. Something quiet passed through me. Not pain this time, but almost gratitude. Some people build the trap for you and call it confidence. I opened my spiral notebook to the page marked lemon roast chicken. You are right about one thing, Vanessa. It is a recipe book. A few heads turned. I laid it open beneath the document camera. The first page showed neat ingredients in blue ink. Under the fold, in smaller writing, were dates, invoice numbers, vendor names, and wire amounts. I turned another page. Pot roast. Beneath it, a shell company registered in Delaware. Another page. Apple pie. Beneath it, 3 Meridian option letters. Every dinner you attended in my house, I said. You discussed another piece of the plan because you believed the woman serving coffee could not follow the conversation. Vanessa's face hardened. This is absurd. No, I said. It is documented. Judge Ellis leaned forward. Mrs. Hale, are you alleging Ms. Cole used corporate funds to position Meridian for acquisition? I turned one final page and placed a bank record beside the notebook. I am alleging she did more than position them. She was paid by them. The courtroom changed in one breath. Richard turned slowly toward Vanessa, and for once she had no performance ready. Her hand moved toward her purse. The bailiff stepped closer, not touching her, simply present. Judge Ellis's voice cut clean through the air. Miss Cole, you will remain seated. Vanessa froze. Richard looked back at me, and the anger had drained out of him, leaving only disbelief. You knew all this, he whispered. I held his gaze. I learned it while making your breakfast. The courtroom did not explode the way people imagine truth explodes. No one shouted. No one overturned a chair. The real sound of a life-changing moment was smaller than that. Paper sliding across polished wood. A judge taking off her glasses. Richard Hale breathing like a man who had just discovered the floor beneath him was glass. Vanessa sat perfectly still, but her stillness was not calm anymore. It was calculation with nowhere to go. Judge Ellis ordered a recess and directed the clerk to seal the financial exhibits until proper corporate counsel could review them. Then she looked at Richard. Mr. Hale, your proposed settlement is suspended pending verification of ownership interests, disclosure accuracy, and potential misrepresentation of marital assets. Richard's attorney lowered his head as if he already knew the next hour would cost his client more than any divorce ever could. The bailiff guided everyone into the hallway. Cameras were not allowed inside, but word had traveled anyway. 2 local business reporters stood near the elevators. A junior associate from Richard's firm whispered into her phone. Vanessa's heels clicked quickly across the tile until she reached a corner by the vending machines, where she turned on Richard with a smile so thin it barely looked human. Do not let her do this, she said. Richard looked at her as if he was seeing her office, her reports, her late-night calls, and my missing bracelet all at once. Did Meridian pay you? He asked. Vanessa's eyes flicked toward me, then back to him. You are upset. That is understandable. Answer me. His voice was quiet, but stripped of performance. For 1 second, I felt the ache of the man he might have been if humility had reached him sooner. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her tone. I protected you from becoming your mother's shadow. Meridian was going to make you national. Emily wants to drag you back into charity projects and sentimental housing developments. I almost laughed, but the sadness was too heavy. Eleanor's sentimental housing developments had put roofs over 2,000 families in Cook County. Richard knew that. He had once been proud of that. Then pride changed the definition of success until people became numbers and legacy became a headline. Richard turned to me. His face had gone pale beneath the courtroom lights. Why did you not tell me? He asked. There it was, the question men like Richard ask when consequences finally arrive, as if truth had failed them by not begging loudly enough. I held the wooden box against my coat. I tried. At breakfast. At dinner. In the car after the board retreat. In your office when I asked why Meridian's draft removed employee protections. You told me to stay out of matters I did not understand. His mouth tightened. You could have said who you were. I should not have needed a last name to be worth hearing. The words landed between us, clean and final. Richard looked away first. Vanessa's expression changed again. Softness now. A performance for a different audience. Emily, she said, whatever you think happened, this can be handled privately. Women like us should not tear each other down in public. I studied her braceletless wrist, the careful blazer, the controlled smile. Women like us? I asked. You mean women underestimated by powerful men? Or women willing to use that underestimation to steal from families, employees, and a dying woman's legacy? The softness vanished. Before Vanessa could answer, Judge Ellis's clerk opened the courtroom door and called us back in. Inside, the judge had reviewed enough to make her next words steady. The court is issuing a temporary hold on the divorce settlement, a preservation order on disputed assets, and a referral of the financial exhibits to the appropriate authorities for investigation. Vanessa's attorney, who had appeared in record time, objected. Judge Ellis allowed him 10 seconds, then cut him off. This court will not be used as a broom to sweep corporate fraud under a marital rug. Richard closed his eyes. Vanessa stared straight ahead. I opened the wooden box one last time and removed the scratched wedding ring. It looked so small in my palm. 3 years of dinners, silence, hospital rooms, signatures, and waiting for a man to remember how to see me. Judge Ellis asked if I wished to amend my response to the dissolution petition. I stood. Yes, Your Honor. I am not contesting the divorce. I am contesting the lie that I was never part of what he built. Richard turned slowly. Something wet shone in his eyes, but I no longer had room to carry it for him. "Emily," he whispered. I placed the ring on the table, not as a weapon, not as a plea, but as evidence of a contract already broken in every way that mattered. I will not fight to stay married to a man who needed a judge to ask my name before he remembered I had one. The preservation order changed the air around Richard Hale faster than any scandal headline could have. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the marble hallway outside courtroom 6B was filled with low voices, vibrating phones, and the kind of panic wealthy people try to hide behind calm faces. Hale Group's board had received notice. Meridian Capital had paused all public comment. Vanessa's attorney stood near the elevator speaking in clipped sentences while she stared at the floor, no longer the woman who had smiled across my dining table. Richard sat alone on a bench beneath a framed photograph of the old courthouse, his charcoal suit still perfect, his hands not. They trembled once before he clasped them together. I had seen those hands sign contracts, hold champagne glasses, adjust cufflinks, ignore mine in rooms full of people. Now they looked empty. I walked past him toward a small conference room the clerk had assigned for emergency review. He stood when he saw me. "Emily, please." The word please sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. I stopped, not because I owed him a conversation, but because some endings deserve a clear door, not a slammed one. "I did not know about Vanessa," he said. "Not all of it. But you knew enough." He looked down. For once, he did not deny what silence had already confessed. "I knew she wanted the merger. I knew she thought my mother's old projects made us look small. I knew you hated it, and I told myself you hated change because you did not understand scale." "No," I said. "I hated it because Meridian was going to gut the worker housing division and sell the land to luxury developers." His face tightened. "They said those properties were underperforming. They were homes." He flinched as if the word had weight. Down the hall, one of his senior employees, a woman named Marcy who had worked for Hale Group for 28 years, stood watching us with red eyes and a folder pressed to her chest. She had recognized the danger long before Richard did, but no one had listened to her either. That was the illness inside the company. Not only fraud, not only ambition. It was the habit of ignoring quiet people until the room collapsed. Judge Ellis had ordered an emergency corporate review within 48 hours, but I did not need 48 hours to know what came next. In the conference room, I sat across from Richard, his attorney, 2 board members on a video call, and a temporary corporate monitor appointed by the court. My wooden box rested beside the projector. My spiral notebook lay open to the apple pie page, the one that first connected Vanessa to Meridian's consulting payments. Daniel Price looked exhausted now, the expensive polish scraped off his voice. "Mrs. Hale, what exactly are you requesting?" I folded my hands. Voting enforcement of the Whitmore Protective shares, immediate suspension of the Meridian merger, removal of Vanessa Cole from financial authority pending investigation, and a full audit of vendor contracts dating back 36 months. One board member cleared his throat. "That is a significant intervention. So was saving this company from default 3 years ago," I said. The room went still. Richard looked at me, but this time there was no disbelief left. Only the slow, painful recognition that his empire had survived because of a woman he had reduced to seating charts and grocery lists. The corporate monitor reviewed the trust documents, the missed repayment notices, Eleanor's charter protections, and the emergency clauses tied to the bridge financing. Page by page, the truth became less emotional and more official. That was the strange comfort of documents. They did not care who felt embarrassed. They simply remained true. At 5:17, the monitor confirmed what Eleanor had prepared and Richard had ignored. Whitmore Holdings held temporary controlling authority to protect Hale Group from damaging transfer or fraudulent acquisition. Richard leaned back as if the chair had disappeared beneath him. "So she controls the vote," one board member said. The monitor nodded. "For emergency protective purposes, yes." Every eye turned to me. I thought of Eleanor in her hospital bed. I thought of the kitchen at midnight. I thought of Marcy in the hallway, and the maintenance crew, and the tenants in Hale-built apartments who had no idea a merger almost turned their leases into numbers on a spreadsheet. I closed the wooden box. "Then my first vote is simple," I said. "The Meridian deal is dead." Richard closed his eyes. Outside the glass wall, Marcy covered her mouth with one hand. For the first time all day I let myself breathe. Not because I had won my divorce. Because I had finally used my name for something larger than proving Richard wrong. The final hearing did not feel like a victory at first. It felt quiet. Too quiet for everything that had broken open. 3 weeks passed between the emergency order and the day Judge Ellis signed the final dissolution, and in those 3 weeks, Chicago turned from rain to early winter. Bare trees lined the streets outside the courthouse. Steam rose from coffee carts near the curb. Men and women in dark coats hurried past with folders tucked under their arms, each carrying private disasters the world would never notice. Richard arrived without Vanessa, without the proud army of people who used to orbit him. The investigation had moved forward. Her accounts had been frozen, her access revoked, and Meridian's name had disappeared from Hale Group's future as if it had never belonged there. Richard's suit was still expensive, but he looked smaller inside it. Not poor. Not ruined. Just unguarded in a way wealth could not fix. I sat across the aisle with my own attorney this time. A calm woman from my old legal circle who had hugged me in the hallway and said, "Welcome back, Emily." Those 2 words had nearly undone me more than any insult Richard ever gave. Welcome back. As if the woman I had been was not gone, only waiting under folded linens, grocery lists, and years of being mistaken for background noise. Judge Ellis finalized the divorce without drama. The court recognized my ownership interests, preserved Eleanor's charter protections, and approved an independent audit of Hale Group. Richard agreed to step down as chief executive officer for 1 year, while the board restructured under temporary Whitmore oversight. He did not fight it. Perhaps because the evidence left him no clean story. Perhaps because, at last, he understood that leadership was not the loudest voice at the table, but the person willing to protect what others depended on. When the judge asked if either party had anything to add, Richard stood slowly. For a moment I thought he would apologize to the court, to the board, to his own reputation. But he turned toward me instead. "Emily," he said, and this time he did not say Hale after it. "I thought the name I gave you was the important one." His voice thinned. I was wrong. The room held still. I did not smile. I did not cry. Some apologies arrived too late to rebuild a home, but not too late to close a door with dignity. "Yes," I said softly. "You were." Outside on the courthouse steps the sky was bright and cold. Richard followed me down the stone stairs, stopping a few feet away. "Is there any version of this where we start over?" he asked. I looked at him and for the first time in months I did not feel anger. Only distance. Clean, necessary distance. "No," I said. "There is a version where you become better. But not with me waiting in your kitchen to prove it." He looked down at his hands. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the scratched wedding ring. I had meant to leave it in the wooden box forever, but endings need their own honesty. I placed it in his palm. "You thought this ring made me Mrs. Hale," I said. "But my name saved your company." His fingers closed around it slowly. Behind us reporters called questions, but I kept walking. 1 year later, the old Evanston office opened again, not as a forgotten archive, but as the Whitmore Women's Legal Center. We kept the brick walls, restored Eleanor's conference table, and turned the archive room into a library for women rebuilding their lives after divorce, financial control, and years of being told they were not smart enough to understand the papers they were asked to sign. Marcy became operations director. The worker housing division expanded into 3 new Illinois counties. Hale Group changed its name to Whitmore Hale Development, not to honor Richard, but to honor Eleanor's belief that business should leave people with keys, not just contracts. On opening day, I stood in the kitchen we built for clients who came in cold, tired, and scared. Fresh coffee warmed the air. Lemon soap sat by the sink. On the wall near the entrance hung the small wooden box, sealed behind glass with Eleanor's brass key, her letter, my old spiral notebook, and the ring resting side by side. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "Never shrink to fit inside someone else's pride." I touched the glass once, then turned toward a young woman waiting at the front desk with a folder clutched to her chest and fear in her eyes. She whispered, "I am not sure I belong here." I smiled because I knew that sentence. I had lived inside it. Then I opened the door wider and said, "Tell me your name."